Welcome again to the Spring 2022 Sonnabend Lecture. Greetings to the Lesley faculty, students, staff, and alumni who are attending tonight, and to all our visitors in and around our community. I welcome you to Lesley University. A very special welcome to our guest of honor, Dr. Angela Davis. I would also like to give a special welcome to our sponsors of this lecture, the Sonnabend family. We have with us tonight, Stephanie and Nancy. Thank you both for being here, and thank you also for your continued support over the years. We acknowledge that we are still in the midst of COVID and feel extremely fortunate to be here in this space at this time. While we are unable to be together in person, please know that we are craving those hugs and long embraces that are way overdue. Let me also take this opportunity to bring to the Zoom mic our Chief Academic Officer and Provost, Dr. Jonathan Jefferson, to share his greetings. Dr. Jefferson.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our president, Janet Steinmeier, and myself, I would like to once again welcome you to Lesley University for those who are guests and visitors. It is such a pleasure for us to have the opportunity to have Dr. Angela Davis come. Dr. Davis, we are so happy that you were able to fit us in your schedule and accept our invitation to be our Sonnabend lecturer for this evening. We are so excited to have the opportunity to hear from you. I have to admit that as a young man, I've always admired you from afar. And I can tell you what a treat it has been, even over Zoom, to have a chance to meet you almost face-to-face and in person. So I want to thank you because to me, you've always been famous. And now I get a chance to see somebody who I've always felt famous and felt someone that I could always say yes to the types of things that you have been doing. We want to thank you for all of the work that you've done, the work you've done in class, in gender, in race, and even in the US prison system, for taking a voice and taking a stand in areas that have not been popular, areas that have caused you great physical and emotional distress, and yet you continue to persevere. And you continue. I was sitting here thinking, I said, I've got to ask Dr. Davis what vitamins she's taking because you look absolutely marvelous. And so time has been on your side. And I just cannot say enough for having this opportunity to have you be a portion of the Lesley community for this evening. I promise to be a man of few words tonight, so I'm going to stop. But I just want to say welcome, thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you this evening, Dr. Davis.
Thank you, Dr. Jefferson. So let me also take care of some housekeeping rules for tonight's program. You probably know by now that this program is being recorded. Our program tonight is also being done in a seminar style format. We will begin the program with Dr. Angela Davis in the moderated conversation, followed by a Q&A session. While we cannot see each of you, we are grateful that you are here and would love to get your questions. Please feel free to share them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There are also some resources which include Dr. Davis's publications that are available through the Lesley Library, and I'll share the link in the chat as soon as I'm finished here. At this time, I would like to bring to the Zoom mic Dr. Nancy Waring, who will introduce our speaker and moderator. But first, I'd like to introduce you to her. Dr. Waring is a newly appointed Professor Emerita. She is the founding director of the Lesley University Mindfulness Master's Degree Program, the only program of its kind in the US. She began developing and teaching mindfulness theory and practice-based courses at Lesley, along with being a meditation teacher in the early 2000s, and has been practicing insight meditation since 1990. She is trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction and is a speaker and consultant on mindfulness at conferences, academic institutions, hospitals, and other venues, where her presentations focus primarily on relational and socially engaged mindfulness. Her writing focuses on Western and integrative medicine, mindfulness, and social justice issues, especially those related to incarceration. She is a founder of a home for homeless and previously incarcerated women. She is also the recipient of a City of Cambridge Peace and Justice Award for her longtime advocacy on behalf of women with HIV/AIDS with a history of incarceration. Please welcome Dr. Nancy Waring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And it's now my turn and my pleasure to introduce our moderator and my colleague, Professor Michelle Vital. So, Michelle Vital is an assistant professor of international higher education and co-director of the Institute for English Language Programs Beyond Borders at Lesley University. Dr. Vital has nearly 20 years of experience in post-secondary education, including in student services, international education, teaching and academic service, and higher education scholarship. Her primary line of inquiry is related to the global dimensions of higher education. Broadly, her interests center on a country and regional focus on Haiti and the Caribbean, student experiences in higher education, scholar practitioner preparation, and critical reflexive practice in academia. Questions that Professor Vital asks are, what are the consequences of these realities and how do they impact experience in higher education context? Thank you very much. Michelle, it's wonderful to have you here and wonderful to have you as our moderator for this event. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Angela Davis. As many of you know, her activism and scholarship over the last half century, Dr. Davis has been deeply involved in the quest for social justice. And many of us who are here today have been alive long enough to follow her quest throughout this whole time period. I'm one of those people, and so especially pleased to have this opportunity. So Dr. Davis's work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities. That is so important to Dr. Davis in the struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Her teaching career has taken her to the West Coast and the East Coast and elsewhere. And I won't name all the places that she's taught because the list is very long, but certainly very impressive. And currently, she is Distinguished Professor Emerita of the History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and also Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's the author of 9 books, count them, 9 books, and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as in numerous continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the criminalization of communities that are mostly affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws on her own experience in the early 70s when she spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Dr. Davis has conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent single-authored book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundations of a Movement, was published in 2016, followed by Abolition, Feminism, Now, co-authored with Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie. And these 4 collaborators managed to pull off this book entirely on Zoom. Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Davis has helped popularize the idea of a prison industrial complex and urges her audience to seriously consider the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. On that striking note, we turn to our session with Dr. Davis. Our colleague, Dr. Michelle Vital, will moderate a 45-minute interview. We've saved half an hour of this truly special occasion for audience questions in the chat following the conversation between Dr. Vital and Dr. Davis. So thank you all so much for being here, and a very warm welcome to everyone, and especially to you, Dr. Davis. It's a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us and to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis, welcome, and thank you for joining our community today. Like the many individuals who are in attendance, I'm eager to hear and learn from you this evening. So let us begin. Dr. Davis, you are an interesting case study of how opinions shift and change with the passage of time. You were a part of a movement that was labeled and vilified. Efforts for revolution and liberation were suppressed, and your very life was at risk. But now today, you continue to be a force for justice, and your wisdom is sought even in academia. So if you could share with us, what have you learned from your lived experiences about staying the course in activism and meaningful solidarity?
Well, good afternoon, I guess. On the East Coast, it's good evening to all of you. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this annual Sonnabend Lecture, which honors the memory of Elsa Sonnabend. Well, thank you so much for that question. I'm reminded in reflecting on the question of something that Simone de Beauvoir said many years ago. She said, if you live long enough, you will see every victory turn into a defeat. And we'll talk about the defeats, I think, a bit later. I want to make the point that you might also reverse that and say that if you live long enough, you might see some defeats turn into victories. I'm not really surprised that what once seemed to be demands so radical that only those who identified with revolutionary movements embrace those demands. But now they're being embraced by people who hardly even consider themselves on the left. And I guess I can say that even 50 years ago, although I certainly thought then that the revolution was imminent, I think many of us assumed that the revolution was literally around the corner. But even then, even 50 years ago, I also tried to keep in mind the long view of history, the long Black liberation movement, which stretched back to the era of slavery, and the long working class movement. And eventually, when I became more conscious of the importance to incorporate feminist concerns, the long feminist movement that intersected in very important ways with anti-racist movements and anti-capitalist movements. To begin to address your question about how what I've learned, I guess, from these many decades. I suppose I should say that I've learned not to be swayed off course by trends that often emphasize individual or individualistic aggrandizement. But I've also learned how important it is to update our ideas and our theories and our strategies, our practices. I've learned that as important as it may be to recognize the lessons of struggles of the past, it's equally essential to learn from those who represent the future, to learn from those who are closest to the future, to learn from young people. And I suppose I can say that I've also learned over the years how to eschew sectarianism. And I try, always to be involved in conversations and planning sessions, strategy sessions with people with whom I may not entirely politically agree. But I've learned from activist thinkers such as Audre Lorde that difference can be an important instigator. It can actually bring us together. We often think about having to transcend our differences or move beyond our differences. But over the years, I think I have learned that it may be very important to see our differences as what allows us to come together, our differences as the potential glue holding us together.
I appreciate you saying that, in particular, mentioning that difference can be an important instigator that brings us together. And I would say that higher education institutions are certainly places of definitely community, but oftentimes of difference and opportunities for discourse. So with that in mind, my next few questions are related to higher education. And so the first question is, within the context of academia and higher education, how do you describe solidarity and social justice that's meaningful versus performative?
Well, of course, I would never encourage displays of solidarity and the appearance of involvement in social justice movements that are merely performative. But I have noticed that the more meaningful and the more powerful our movements become, the more some people are pushed to pretend that they are a part of those movements, that they are important participants in those movements. And I have to admit that it used to really bother me that there would be these kinds of hangers-on who would want to take advantage of the fact that those of us who were doing the scholarly work, doing the activist work, making certain ideas more available and more embraceable by larger numbers of people. That, I used to I used to be really, really critical of them, and now I think I recognize that when you begin to see these, sort of performative people who want to pretend that they are involved, that's a sign that you've made a lot of progress. That is a sign that you have begun to move forward, and that others who may not have been involved in, helping the movement to grow, realize that in order for them to appear legitimate, that they have to pretend as if they were involved. I can remember many, many years ago when I was a very young activist in Los Angeles. I would say to people, you know, you really need to get involved in this movement right now. You really need to begin to do some of the work and you know, spread the word, because there will come a time when your grandchildren will ask you about this period. And you don't want to have to pretend that you were in the rank and file of the movements to defend, for example, the Black Panther Party against the repression that virtually destroyed them. So we were imagining, you know, those who were unwilling to participate as these performative participants, I guess, in retrospect. But you know, I don't know whether I would waste my time exposing them. I think the most important thing is to do the work. And the more we do the work, the more the radical discourse is legitimized, the stronger our movements, the broader our movements. And that's really what I'm concerned about.
You know, I appreciate you saying that. And you began your response by talking about, you know, perhaps earlier in your career, you and other scholars really addressing social forces that needed to be addressed related to justice and perhaps intersectional movements. And yet today, there are those with different positionalities who feel like this rise in scholar activists has come out of nowhere, right? And they question their presence. So my question for you is, do you believe academics should be solely focused on teaching, training, and preparing, and leaving activism for others, or is there a place for activism in academia?
Well, you know, I think that all knowledge, if it is valuable, has an impact on our world. And it helps to make our worlds more inhabitable. You know, whether we're talking about scientific knowledge, you know, whether we're talking about the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Ultimately, the purpose of knowledge is to make the world more habitable, not only for human beings, but for all living creatures. And how that happens is very complicated. But I think that what we call activism, you know, working for social justice, working against racism, you know, working against the denial of rights to LGBTQ communities, you know, working for reproductive justice, working against climate change and for environmental justice. You know, all of these issues rest squarely on knowledge that is produced both inside institutions such as the academy and knowledge that is produced in other venues. I think that as we speak about the necessity of intellectual involvement in social movements, we should also recognize that knowledge gets produced elsewhere, that the academy is not the only place where people learn. And as a matter of fact, because the academy tends to represent itself as the monopolization of knowledge, we don't recognize the knowledge that has been generated in other places, in the community, in movements, behind walls. As a matter of fact, as someone who has been working on issues of prison abolition for many, many years, I have to recognize that the foundations for the field that many of us identify into, which is something that we sometimes call critical prison studies, interdisciplinary critical prison studies, that the foundational categories and concepts were actually developed by people behind bars. So I embrace a kind of radical interdisciplinarity, an interdisciplinarity that goes beyond academic fields, but that reaches out and acknowledges how often people who have not had professional preparation with respect to their intellectual work, how they have played an extremely important role in the production of knowledge. So once one recognizes that, then it seems to me to be absolutely crystal clear that knowledge and activism go hand in hand, and that activism is not this this specific, this kind of marginal activity, but rather it is very broad, and it's not just about marching in the streets and making demands, although that's very important. It's about discovering new ways of thinking about the world. It's about the imagination. It's about educating the imagination, encouraging people to think beyond the moment and to imagine the impact of the work we do now on communities, human and non-human alike, that will evolve decades and perhaps centuries from now.
I appreciate your emphasis that the academy is not the only place where people learn, right? That higher education institutions do not have a monopoly on knowledge and knowledge production. And yet they're in almost every community, at least here within this country. And so what are your ideas about the role of higher education institutions leveraging their expertise, their resources, their very presence to push local governments to address social matters? Some of the ones you mentioned are LGBT rights, rights for the transgender community, climate change, among others. What can higher education do?
There's so much that institutions of higher education can do. First of all, I think that they should always be aware of their own situatedness in communities. There is this, there's this a tendency to represent the university as at war with the surrounding community, the town versus gown, or town and gown, or whatever. But I think that if universities were to imagine themselves as a part of the communities in which they are situated, then they would feel much more accountable. Columbia University, for example, is right in the middle of Harlem. And, why don't we think about Harlem when we think about Columbia? Mills College, which is, one of the, one of the women's colleges that still exists, is in the community where I live, which is largely African American and people of color. So I think that they should be aware of their literal situatedness, but at the same time, they have to encourage the kind of activism that will help to de-provincialize the way we think about our communities and our country, and to encourage, and I really appreciate the fact that the work that you're doing, global education, because I think that is one of the major challenges in this country. People who grow up in the US are not really encouraged to think of themselves as a part of an international context, a global context. We've heard proclamation that the United States is the greatest country in the world so many times that even those of us who are radical activists begin to believe it and end up working within a very provincial context. But in response to that question, I was going to mention one thing, and that is the movement, the anti-police movement. I guess I should put it that way. And I know that particularly at this moment, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, of course, although many people are acting as if we're on the other side. But we did learn about structural racism. And when I say we, I'm talking about vast numbers of people, because some of us, of course, have been arguing that you have to think about the structural character of racism in order not to assume that racism is always only attached to individuals, that it's always about who's racist and who's not. I don't care so much whether whoever it might hold racist ideas. I care about the fact that in universities and the healthcare system and the system of policing, racism is a major component of their very structures. And therefore it acts even when no individual consciously attempts to use that institution in a racist manner. We learned about this during the pandemic when we saw that it was Indigenous people and Black people and Latinx people who were suffering most as a consequence of the pandemic because of the structural racism of the healthcare system. And then, of course, when we began to see as a larger community, as a country, all of these official police assaults leading to lynchings, such as the police lynching of George Floyd, and I'm thinking also of Breonna Taylor, and I'm thinking about all of those individual cases that we collectively witnessed, and people became aware of the fact that something is wrong. However, now, because of the way ideology functions, there are those who are arguing, well, the crime rate is up because of the fact that people were calling for defunding the police. And I mention this because I think the university can play a really important role in teaching people how to see through those ideologies, that propaganda, and also recognizing that there's a connection between campus police and police in the surrounding communities, and that we might actually begin to take on the question of how do we truly make our communities safer? And what is security? Is security only obtainable as a consequence of the use of violent weapons? Or, perhaps we might rethink health, safety, security in terms of access to healthcare, especially mental healthcare, access to housing, access to education. All of this would make our communities safer, much more so than people pretending to defend our communities with guns.
Dr. Davis, you shared so much, and there's so many things I want to backtrack a bit and unpack. But I'll just say, your emphasis on focusing on structures and really considering the structures and how that impacts racism is really critical. And if we look at higher education, the history of higher education, women, people of color, religious minorities have been excluded from U.S. higher education well into the 20th century, right? And so this increased calls today for equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice is rooted in that. And I do believe that a framework for viewing not only the history of higher education, but contemporary realities is critical race theory, which we know has been politicized to quite a great degree, right? And but you began your conversation today talking about young people. And so I want to stay there for a little bit and say that we know that young people have had a presence in protests and movements from the beginning of time, perhaps, and the rise of social media has helped to accelerate their participation as well as the various forms of their activism. And so what advice can you provide to young folks who want to be more active in their communities in response to what they're observing locally, nationally, and across the globe, but they're not sure how to begin, and they might be concerned about the implications of their activism?
Well, first of all, I think that young people should not only ask themselves about how to shift from their current activities to a period of activism around social issues and how they need to change in order to become social activists, because oftentimes that is the question people are interested in. How do I remake myself into an activist? And I want to encourage young people to think differently, to think about their own strengths, their own proclivities, their own desires, and shift the question from how can I change to how can I make my own ideas, my own dreams, my own talents relevant to a collective struggle for social justice and liberation. Because only by discovering something that will bring fulfillment to the individual can one hope to encourage a long trajectory of activism. Otherwise people get involved in this movement or that movement for a little while and they burn themselves out, they get tired of doing it, and they need something that is going to make them feel not exhausted, but fulfilled. And I think personally, I've been fortunate to, before I even learned how to ask that question, to do things that have brought me a great deal of joy, a great deal of fulfillment. Because I early on, decided that I liked ideas, and that's why I studied philosophy. I realized that this capacity to examine and produce ideas is extremely important to movements. And I often talk about the fact that when I was a child, my mother always encouraged me and my siblings to try to imagine a world that was not segregated so severely as the city where we grew up, Birmingham, Alabama, was. At that time, it was the most segregated city in the country. And so she encouraged us to imagine a different time, a different organization of that world. And from the time I was very, very young, I engaged in those kinds of, I would say, trajectories of the imagination, and then learned that that's important to the movement. I can be of assistance to the movement by doing that. So if young people are interested in art, how can that art be rendered valuable to the development of a collective movement? How can music, how can an interest in science help? So I think that's the question I would ask.
Yeah, I think, the pandemic has provided an opportunity for that sort of consideration of what one's ideas or dreams or talents are, and how that can be used in service to others or the collective. And you mentioned the collective struggle for social justice and liberation, which I think is a great segue for what I want to focus on next, which is we have observed increased efforts of individuals wanting to engage in dialogue regarding the conflict between Israel and Palestine, something that you've discussed in the past. Simply stated, on the one hand, some individuals conceptualize critiques of Israel's engagement with Palestine as thinly veiled anti-Semitism, while on the other hand, individuals conceptualize support of Palestine as seeking liberation for individuals there. How do you make sense of this disconnect, and what suggestions do you have for meaningful dialogue on this sensitive topic?
Well, first of all, I don't think it should be such a special or such a sensitive topic, because it's a question of justice. And if we have demanded justice for Jews who suffered under Nazism and the Holocaust, then we also have to be willing to demand justice for Palestinians who have been evicted from their homes and deprived of the right to live in peace and freedom in Palestine. And, of course, there are accusations of anti-Semitism. And, this is a part of, this is an indication of the effectiveness of ideology. And I would say that most people who take the time to actually study a little, it doesn't require a great deal of study, will recognize that the question of Palestine is a human rights issue, and that those of us who criticize the state of Israel for its military occupation of Palestine, for its apartheid wall, for its extremely discriminatory policies, to the extent that Palestinians cannot drive on throughways that are designed to transport Israeli settlers from one settlement to another within occupied Palestine. Now, those of us who have experienced the era of racist segregation in the U.S., I visited Palestine with someone who was born in South Africa, and we kept seeing the connections between our experiences of racial segregation, our experiences of apartheid, when we were in Palestine. And I think that many people just really do not understand what is going on and don't bother to be critical of the ways in which the ideology of Zionism has completely muddled the issue. I can remember when I also believed that, the situation is just so complicated. This conflict has been going on for so long, and you have to understand this aspect of it and that aspect of it. And in that sense, it was very different from other social justice issues, because nobody said, you have to understand the position of the white supremacists. You have to understand, how it is that Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and so forth, before you are able to say no to racism. Nobody ever said that, but they say that about what they call the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and even representing it as a conflict makes us forget that we're talking about a state that is a militarized state versus people, many of whom are just trying to preserve where they grew up, where their ancestors have lived, and to avoid being evicted. I think that we have a great deal to do. I mean, let me say that I've been involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement for a very, very long time. Since I was in college, as a matter of fact. I went to Brandeis, which is a university that was founded in this same year as the State of Israel. And I always like to point out that my introduction to the need to generate solidarity for the Palestinians came from my Jewish classmates. That is where I first learned about Palestinian solidarity. But what I can say is that during this current period, when I say current, I mean, perhaps the last 20 years or so, the connection between the Black movement in this country and the Palestinian movement has been very fruitful. And I think that the Black movement in this country has benefited a great deal more from that connection than the Palestinians have. I still think that those of us who are involved in the Black movement still have deep debts to the Palestinian people who were at the forefront of the international campaign for solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And I don't know whether we would have such widespread influence and support all over the world had not it been for the fact that the Palestinians pioneered that solidarity.
As you can imagine, your thoughts on this question has resonated with many people who have shared their thoughts in the chat, and I do appreciate this point of correction, and which I appreciate, that this is not a both sides issue as it was presented when one entity holds immense power over another. It's simply put, it's not a conflict, right? And indeed, and I please apologize if I mispronounce the name, want to definitely acknowledge Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American journalist who was recently murdered, reporting on this very issue, this occupation. And so it has many, the conversation continues and needs to continue certainly on this topic. And when you began to answer the question, you sort of conceptualized it as a human rights issue. And so continuing with that human rights, I want to move on to my next question, which is the 13th Amendment.
May I just add one more?
Yes.
Yeah, just another brief observation. And this has to do with our assumptions that we have to be for or against. We cannot embrace both and so this out of this question of logic, I think, emerges the assumption that if you support the Palestinians, you must be opposed to the Jews. And that is, absolutely inaccurate. As a matter of fact, there are many Jewish organizations that are playing absolutely pivotal roles in the struggle for justice in in Palestine. And as someone who grew up in the South, as I pointed out before, I will never forget that that in general, the white people in the South who became allies of Black people struggling against racism were Jewish people. And as a matter of fact, when churches were bombed in Birmingham, synagogues were also bombed and destroyed. So I think that to be opposed to anti-Semitism is, also to be opposed to the racist repression that is meted out to the Palestinians. One has to have a both and position here.
As opposed to an either or.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that additional nuance. So continuing the conversation on human rights issues and given your work on prison reform, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. However, we know that people in prison work for free, and many equate prison labor as slave labor, despite it being permitted under the law. We also know that many Black and Brown individuals have racialized experiences within the criminal justice system, which has led to many being falsely imprisoned or receiving inordinately longer prison sentences. Can you address this in the context of your long-term commitment to the abolitionist movement and discuss your views of abolition strategies?
Okay, this is a question that we could have spent the entire hour on, and I'm going to try to be a bit succinct. First of all, it is so important to make the connection between anti-slavery abolitionism and anti-prison and anti-police abolitionism. But those of us who've been promoting this for a long time often make the point that it's not so much an analogical relationship. It's not so much that we say that prisons are like slavery, and therefore we adopt the abolitionist strategies, anti-slavery abolitionist strategies. There is instead of being an analogy, we look at it in terms of genealogy, so that there is a historical connection between prisons and the institution of slavery. And that has to do with the fact that when slavery was putatively abolished, when enslaved people were no longer subject to the chains of slavery, new mechanisms for control were developed. And those mechanisms involve the police. And we know that the police in this country evolved out of slave patrols and so forth and so on, and prisons as methods of controlling the bodies of formerly enslaved people. So that, if I had time, I could do a whole lecture on that, but I would just like people to think about that historical relationship. Now, the second point I want to make is that slavery involves so much more than involuntary labor. That is the way it is described in the Constitution, right? When you look at the 13th Amendment, it's slavery or and involuntary servitude. But W.E.B. Du Bois was critical of the whole notion that slavery had been abolished because it involves so much. It's about slavery was about the absolute power of the slaveholders to control the lives of the enslaved, not only in terms of labor, but in terms of their reproductive processes, in terms of their capacity to get an education, to read and write, and so forth and so on. And I think that it's so important to point out that those aspects of slavery were not abolished, even though by law, perhaps the question of involuntary servitude was dealt with, although it wasn't really, we know that. But there were so many other aspects of slavery that lived on and that are responsible for the fact that over 150 years after the so-called abolition of slavery, we are still dealing with the resonances of slavery in our society. And that is what this collective coming to consciousness in the summer of 2020 was about. It was about the fact that we have to begin to do the work that should have been done in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Otherwise we wouldn't have all of these examples of structural racism. So I think that it's important to look at W.E.B. Du Bois and his position, his argument that abolition of slavery, full abolition of slavery would have involved not only the negative dismantling of the system, but the recreation of a society, of a democratic society, with the redevelopment, the reimagining of all of its institutions that would permit of the participation of previously enslaved people. And we're confronting this dilemma now, and at the level of the university, where we call for diversity and equity and inclusion, but we don't talk about reorganizing the university. It's almost as if we say that the institution can remain the same as it was, just bring more people of color in, bring more women in, and let's just get more diversity, and let's see if we can create equity within the context of this existing institution, and let's make this institution, which we know is racist, which we know has structural heteropatriarchy within it, let's just make this more welcoming. Let's just include more of those who were previously excluded. And that's the same dilemma we are confronting as a society. It's not so much about how you bring people in without turning the vision inward and recreating the institutions and producing different structures that themselves will be more welcoming, rather than simply welcoming people into an unchanged institution. So that's, that's the issue. And that's what we try to, when we say prison abolition, we say it's not so much only about getting rid of the prison. It's about recreating a society that no longer has need of these racist and repressive institutions. So it's about healthcare, it's about education, it's about housing, it's about jobs, it's about learning how to use the imagination, it's about all of those things.
Yeah, and I think you are pointing to the conversation we started with, which was doing the real work of justice, not just the performative actions. And within higher education, we know sometimes, we're like, oh, we're reading, land acknowledgements, or we're removing monuments to slaveholders. And those are steps, certainly. But if it stops there, then we're not really doing the work of reimagining or recreating a society, right? That is truly justice oriented. So I'm looking at the time. and the questions I still wanted to ask, with the many questions that are in the chat. So I'm going to pause and invite my colleague, Dr. Nancy Waring, to rejoin us. And she will help to facilitate this next portion of Q&A. And so if you haven't already, please add your questions to the chat, and we will continue asking those questions for the next maybe 22 minutes, and then we'll come to a close.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Dr. Davis. I think the questions, as Sandra wrote, should please be in the Q&A rather than the chat so that we can follow them. And the first question that I'm seeing here came in a little bit earlier, speaks, Dr. Davis, I think, both to a current event and also to what you have mentioned about community and relationality within within activist movements. And one of our participants asks or mentions that she was extremely moved by the recent New Yorker tribute to Kathy Boudin, and learned there of your friendship with Kathy Boudin and her influence on you and your influence on her. The questioner says, her humility and self-reflection seemed to me such a model of activism and care. Could you speak a bit about your friendship, please?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, Kathy and I met when we were both 15 years old. We went to high school together in New York. I had come from Birmingham to New York to attend high school at the Elizabeth Irwin Little Red Schoolhouse on a program that was organized by the American Friends Service Committee. And so it was a progressive high school, and I keep thinking about Kathy, and I still can't believe that that she's not here. She was, she was such she was this quiet rock who supported so much, and I can remember in high school being so impressed by her soccer skills and wishing that I could play soccer like Kathy did. But I learned about Cuba. Kathy's father was the attorney for the Cuban government at the time of the revolution. And so Kathy got to travel to Cuba right after the revolution. But anyway, I should say that we have connected at many moments. We both been activists virtually all of our lives. We were both on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. And as a matter of fact, our class at EI at Elizabeth Irwin, which consisted of only of about 28 people. At one of our reunions, the question was, how did one small class get to produce two women who were on the FBI's 10 most wanted lists? But Kathy, when Kathy got out of prison this last time, she worked toward at first it wasn't about abolition. It was about guaranteeing that previously incarcerated people could find a place in this so-called free world. And she did so much to encourage and guarantee the education of formerly incarcerated women and men and trans people. The conference that she and Cheryl Wilkins, her partner at Columbia University in the Center for Justice there, they held a huge conference every year where people from all over the country came, and it was the most remarkable gathering of people. I am you know, I got to say goodbye to Kathy on the morning that she passed. It was May 1st. And I got up very early in the morning, and her son Chesa and her partner David, who got out, David Gilbert, who got out of prison as a consequence of the work that she was doing with RAP, release aging prisoners, release our aging prisoners now, I think. And so she got to spend time with David. She got to spend time with her grandson. And she got to see Chesa become the district attorney of San Francisco on a campaign, based on a campaign that was opposed to mass incarceration, that was opposed to the lack of police accountability. And I just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I did a fundraiser for Chesa, and to me that is a way of paying tribute to Kathy. And I was telling him that it feels like her spirit is still inspiring us. And I also said that I think she may have chosen to depart on May 1st. I learned about her, the fact that she was gone, that she had died, while I was marching down Market Street with the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union, of which I am an honorary member, on May 1st, International Workers' Day.
Wow. Thank you so much. The next question.
So
I'll take the next question.
Yeah, so we're going to shift a little bit, and this question is from Danielle LaGrose-George, who says, thank you, Dr. Davis, for your powerful comments on the sites of knowledge production occurring both in and beyond the academy. And you're referencing Simone de Beauvoir and Audre Lorde, both writers of literature. Would you speak a little more on the role of culture in the arts and justice movements, liberation, and ultimately humanity?
I'm looking at the question, Danielle George. Thank you so much for that question. Because we would not have a movement that insists on justice, that insists on freedom, if it were not for the humanities, if it were not for the arts. And as a matter of fact, the older I become, the more I become convinced that without art and music and poetry, without ways of stretching the imagination, of educating the imagination, we would not have a movement that is a future-directed movement. We would not have a movement that is about creating a more habitable future. And as I said before, not only for humans, but for our non-human companions as well, and for the flora of our globe, for the environment. Environmental justice is an absolute condition of possibility for all other forms of justice. And so, yes, I believe that our writers, our world is very different as a consequence of the contributions of Toni Morrison, for example. I mean, can you imagine where we would be if we had not learned how to see, what Toni saw as the universal in Black literature, because Black literature was always considered to be the literature of the minority that did not have this kind of resonance, for other communities in the country, not to speak about the world. And without our music, we would not be able to imagine ourselves as a community that has the right to demand a better way of living, a better way of existing together in the universe. I'll say, I think that one of the reasons why people all over the world have focused on Black movements, Black liberation movements from the era of slavery forward, has to do not only with the pain and the suffering. And I get very upset when people only represent slavery as about repression and violence and torture and pain. Because for me, what is so much more important is the fact that Black people managed to figure out how to create beauty even as they were experiencing all of these horrendous forms of repression. And that is what, I think that is what we're all about, happiness and beauty. This is the world we want to see for all of us.
Thank you. Dr. Davis, we have a question in the Q&A about Roe v. Wade. And I'd like to take the opportunity to take the liberty of asking a slightly longer question that was on our list originally with regard to Roe v. Wade. So we are a few weeks away from the leaked reports of the Roe v. Wade decision from the Supreme Court of the United States. Could you please describe the implications of this decision for women, poor women, and women of color in particular? What are your thoughts about the seemingly politicization of the court? What can the collective do to change the trajectory of this decision? Protesting, engaging with elected officials, something else?
Of course, this is upfront for all of us right now, and it's not only about the loss of the right to abortion. It's about a whole series of related liberties and rights. My first response is that we need to focus on what we could have done to prevent this. We didn't prevent it, but we should have been much more perceptive about the potential turn to the right of the Supreme Court. Well, we all knew that that is what was happening when the I always say, I can't even remember his name, the person who last occupied the White House. You know who I'm talking about, though, but I don't like to mention his name. I don't like to pollute the conversation by pronouncing his name. But we knew that is what was their agenda, the Republican agenda, and now the Republican agenda is a ultra right-wing agenda. It's a white supremacist agenda. It's a misogynist, heteropatriarchal agenda, and we have to do everything we can to. We have to march, we have to protest, we have to elect those who are going to challenge, the decision that comes down. I guess we can just pretty much assume that there will be a decision that will be coming down soon. But, I think we need to connect with the international campaign for reproductive justice that is happening all over the Americas. And as a matter of fact, there have been some very important victories recently in South America. Not long ago, it was the case that Uruguay was the only country in South America where women could have abortions performed. But now we know that there have been slight victories in Mexico and Argentina, et cetera. So I think it's really important to link up with that movement, not only in the Americas, but also in Ireland. In Northern Ireland, there's been a very powerful movement asserting abortion rights. And I think we have to avoid falling into the trap of thinking narrowly about abortion rights. And I really like the term reproductive justice, which women of color who've been involved in the movement, in this movement for the last 50 years have insisted on, that allows us to keep the larger context in view. So it's not only about the right to abortion, it's also about the right to bear children. So it's about the right to be free of sterilization abuse. And you can be certain that if this decision comes down from the Supreme Court, there will be other decisions that will make it much less likely that women will be able to defend themselves, especially poor women, especially Black and brown women, Indigenous women, especially women in prison. And just recently in California, we've seen a number of examples of the ways in which imprisoned women have been forcibly sterilized. So I think that this coming movement is going to have to be an intersectional movement. It's going to have to be a broad movement. And we will have to understand that the right wing's use of the issue of abortion rights is connected with so much more, it's connected with larger struggles against racism. It's connected with the reproductive rights of trans and gender non-conforming people. I think that we are going to have to use everything, I would say in our arsenal, but I don't like to use militaristic metaphors, but I think you understand what I mean.
Yeah, Dr. Davis, thank you. I echo my colleague, Nafisa, who is appreciative of how you're differentiating reproductive justice and struggles of working class and BIPOC individuals from those who have the privilege, right, of receiving reproductive care elsewhere. So my hope is to ask a question on a topic that we haven't touched upon yet. So I'm gonna turn to Jessica, who asks about your thoughts about food, specifically your thoughts on food justice and equity.
Okay, is this the last question?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay, well, I just noticed that in the question and answer, the Q&A feature, there's also a question about an uptake in ICE activities. And,
sure.
And I think it's so important to, when we're talking about abolitionist strategies, that we have to think about what is going on in terms of ICE and the detention facilities for immigrants. And I'll just say that the whole concept of a prison industrial complex is designed to attend to the connections between and among all of these institutions. The question of food, which is, brings us together all over the world. And I'm just thinking that I've mentioned anti-capitalist several times during the conversation, but I haven't really foregrounded the role of capitalism in all of these issues. And an examination of food politics requires us to recognize the degree to which the industrialization of food production under conditions of capitalism is responsible in large part for this environmental crisis that we are experiencing now. And for the fact that if things continue in the same way, the earth will no longer be available to humans and other creatures in the future. So I think that food, eating is something everyone does. And we need to imagine a movement in which we encourage people to engage in that activity of nourishing themselves in a conscious way. You know, we don't usually ask questions about what we put in our bodies. It's an activity that is automatic, and we don't ask whether or not we are contributing to the further destruction of the earth by eating in certain ways. And of course, oftentimes we don't really have a choice in the matter because of the role of the industrialized production of food and the huge concerns, the fast food joints and so forth. That really is going to be, I think, an important arena of struggle if we can get over, some of these humps, because, cattle are responsible for the production of so many of the environmental pollutants, and just eating beef is responsible for destroying the ozone layer. But yeah, I think that's going to require a popularization of the critique of capitalism, which began. As a matter of fact, I don't think we would be where we are in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, had it not been for the Arab Spring movement in 2011. And by the way, people are still in prison in places like Egypt for work that they've done over the last years in connection with that movement. And if people are interested in reading, there is an amazing collection of writings by an Egyptian political prisoner whose name is Alaa Abd del Fattah. Alaa Abd el Fattah. And it's called, you can remember the title, it's called You Have Not Yet Been Defeated. You Have Not Yet Been Defeated. And his analysis brings together feminism, brings to the environment, the anti-racist movement. It's a perfect example of intersectional thinking and acting. And I mention him because he's been on a hunger strike for the last more than a month, since I think April 3rd. And I'm appealing to people to find out about him. And you can easily find the book online. You Have Not Yet Been Defeated. And his first name is Alaa and Abd el Fattah. I mean, I thought about him because he points out that unless we figure out how to address the issue of food justice and the environment, that none of these other things will be achievable. It's a very condition of possibility for success in all arenas of social justice. So I'm not a person who tries to be an evangelist when it comes to ways of eating, but just by becoming vegetarian or vegan could help so much in changing the ways in which food production is literally destroying the earth.
Dr. Davis, thank you. And I do want to point out several of my colleagues had shared in the chat a link to the book that Dr. Davis just now mentioned. We are coming to a close, and unfortunately, we're not able to answer any more questions posed in the Q&A, but we can see there are questions related to increasing militarization, surveillance, and risks associated with street-based organization, for example, rise of neoliberalism in the university, and what reimagining higher education would look like. So hopefully, not only this dialogue, but this Q&A will be a point for further dialogue at Lesley University. So thank you again, Dr. Davis, for being in community with us today as Lesley hosts this annual Sonnabend Lecture. This conversation was critical and nuanced and certainly thought-provoking. So I'll now turn it over to Sandra Walker, the Interim Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences, who will offer the closing remarks. Dean Walker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Oh my God, this was such a rich conversation. We could go on and on and on. I have to say, maybe we'll have to bring you back, Dr. Davis, to continue. So thank you all. Let me just take the time to say thank you, Dr. Davis, for your work, for your advocacy on behalf of so many invisible and forgotten men and women throughout the United States and the world, and for your perseverance throughout the years to do this work. This is so much and so very important work. So we are so grateful for all you have done, all you have given up to do this work. So thank you. Thank you also to President Steinmeier and Provost Jefferson for their continued support for this lecture. Thanks again to the Sonnabend family in support of Elsa Sonnabend for their continued support over the years. Thanks to Michelle, Dr. Michelle Vital, for her role as moderator tonight, and Dublin as one of the Q&A facilitators. And thanks to Dr. Nancy Waring for her role in introducing our guests and also as one of the Q&A facilitators. We appreciate all of you. Big thank yous to our planning committee, to Nancy Waring, Susan Gear, and Isabel Olson, and our colleagues in advancement, IT, communications, and marketing. And to our audience here tonight, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your questions. We truly appreciate it. I would like to extend a good night to everyone. Thank you so much.